Ulfric Stormcloak entered the Blue Palace in 4E201, expecting to prove that High King Torygg could not defend the crown he wore. In the history known across Skyrim, the challenge ended with Torygg dead, Ulfric fleeing solitude, and the old argument over Talos, the Empire, and Nordic independence becoming a civil war. The surviving accounts never agreed on every detail. Sybil Stentor remembered the voice tearing Torygg down. Ulfric later maintained that the shout brought the High King to the floor, and that his sword delivered the killing blow. Both accounts agreed on the point that mattered. Torygg accepted the challenge. Ulfric used the Thuum, and one kingly claim survived the room. Change that final fact and Skyrim changes before any army reaches Whiterun. The voice still leaves Ulfric's mouth. The duel still begins for the reasons that brought him to solitude. Torygg still enters it as the younger and less experienced warrior. This time, the shout fails to settle the contest. Torygg survives the force of it, regains enough control to answer with steel, and Ulfric receives the fatal wound. No hidden mage intervenes, no guard strikes from behind, no new weapon enters the room. One survivable moment inside a real canonical duel turns the other way. High King Torygg remains alive. Ulfric Stormcloak dies at his feet. That outcome appears for a few hours to solve the problem that canon lets grow into war. The most powerful advocate for Skyrim independence has challenged the High King under Nordic custom, and lost. The man who could unite Eastmarch soldiers, veterans of Markarth, Talos worshippers, and hostile jarls behind one personal claim cannot leave solitude to rally them. There is no flight through the gate, no later ambush at Darkwater Crossing, no cart carrying Ulfric toward an execution at Helgen. The crown remains on the same head. The moot has no dead High King to replace. The rebellion loses the only figure who can present himself at once as Jarl, war veteran, student of the Greybeards, liberator of Markarth, and claimant to the throne. Yet the grievances that carried Ulfric into the Blue Palace were older than the duel. The White-Gold Concordat had ended the Great War in 4E175 and outlawed Talos worship within the Empire. The Markarth incident had already made Ulfric a symbol of armed resistance and had already given the Thalmor a reason to press harder on enforcement in Skyrim. Alvar of Riverwood later described a period when many Nords kept private Talos shrines despite the treaty, followed by a harsher crackdown after Ulfric agitation forced the issue into public view. The Reach had already bled. Families had already seen worshippers taken. Imperial loyalty and anger toward the Dominion already occupied the same households. None of that disappears because Torygg wins a duel. The Thalmor dossier on Ulfric makes the immediate strategic result even clearer. The Dominion does not need Ulfric to conquer Skyrim for them, it needs the conflict around him to remain unresolved. The dossier describes him as a dormant asset, not as a willing agent, and warns that both a decisive Stormcloak victory and a decisive Imperial victory are undesirable. It goes further. Ulfric's death at Helgen would have increased the chance of Imperial victory, enough to harm Thalmor interests. In this timeline, the Dominion suffers that loss before the Civil War reaches its canonical shape. Elenwen loses a living political weapon at the exact moment when he is most useful. Torygg therefore wins the duel and inherits a more difficult contest. A dead Ulfric cannot command an army, but he can be remembered without ever having to make another compromise, lose another battle, alienate another hold, or answer for the treatment of Dunmer and Argonians in Windhelm. His supporters can preserve the version of him they need. To veterans of Markarth, he becomes the man who fought when Cyrodiil yielded. To Talos worshippers, he becomes the Arl who died challenging a king, tied to the treaty that outlawed their god. To Eastern nobles who already resent imperial influence, he becomes proof that solitude will defend the existing order even when Nordic custom is used against it. Torygg has killed the claimant. He has not killed the claim. The first question is whether the death is treated as murder, execution, or the accepted result of a duel. Canon shows that Skyrim never possessed one uncontested interpretation of what Ulfric did to Torygg. Rogver considered Ulfric's escape honorable because the challenge had followed old custom. General Tullius called the killing murder and usurpation. Torygg himself, when encountered in Sovngarde in the canonical timeline, regarded his own courage during the challenge as important to his honor, reversed the victim, and the same dispute survives. Ulfric supporters can condemn the outcome while struggling to deny that their leader initiated the challenge. Imperial supporters can celebrate Torygg's survival while being careful not to turn an old Nordic custom into a criminal act only because their preferred man won. The reversal also removes one of the first public spectacles that canon turns into propaganda. Rogver never opens the gate for a fleeing Ulfric because there is no fugitive to release. Solitude, therefore, has no reason to execute Rogver for helping the killer of Torygg escape. That matters beyond one life. In canon, the execution at the city gate tells every visitor that the civil war has already reached inside Solitude, and that the Western government regards assistance to Ulfric as treason. Without it, the city begins the crisis without a fresh public death to harden the divide. Supporters of Ulfric still have a corpse to mourn, but Solitude gives them fewer additional names to add beside his. The legal handling of Ulfric body becomes important for the same reason. Torygg gains little from displaying it, denying burial, or treating the dead Jarl as a common criminal. Nord custom and the political facts both favor returning him to Eastmarch with enough dignity to show that the High King accepts the duel as settled. That choice denies Galmar an immediate demand for recovery of the body, and denies Elenwen an easy chance to paint the royal court as frightened of the man it defeated. Windhelm can hold mourning rites. Solitude can present the matter as a challenge answered under Nordic law. Each side keeps its interpretation, but neither receives an obvious second injury around which to mobilize. The absence of Rogger execution also changes how ordinary Western Nords encounter the dispute. Canon begins with the headsman already working in Solitude, and with arguments over Ulfric conduct reaching taverns, markets, and families. This timeline begins with uncertainty instead. News arrives that Ulfric challenged Torygg and died. Some call the result honorable, others call the challenge reckless. People who hate the Concordat can still conclude that Ulfric chose the risk himself. That ambiguity slows recruitment, because anger has to pass through a political judgment rather than through the image of a royal government executing another Nord for loyalty to the dead Jarl. Torygg can use the time created by that uncertainty to make the first royal response about order rather than vengeance. He can send messages to Eastmarch, Whiterun, the Pale, the Rift, and Winterhold, before rumors harden into separate versions of the event. The content does not need to promise reconciliation that he cannot deliver. It only needs to establish that the High King remains alive, that no general punishment has been ordered, and that the Jarls still hold their seats. The immediate question across Skyrim then becomes whether Eastern leaders will choose rebellion despite those facts. That is a worse starting position for anyone trying to recreate the war Ulfric planned. That ambiguity protects Torygg from one danger and exposes him to another. He does not need an imperial tribunal to justify the death. The challenge itself supplies a Nordic argument for his legitimacy. He faced the most famous rebel in Skyrim and survived. For a young High King whose enemies had portrayed him as a soft symbol of imperial submission, that matters more than any proclamation from Sir Rodiel. Men who would never admire the White-Gold Concordat can still understand a king who accepted a challenge and prevailed. Torygg gains the kind of personal authority that canon denied him the chance to develop. The cost is that he must use that authority carefully. If he orders mass arrests in Windhelm, he confirms the accusation that he serves the Empire before Skyrim. If he allows Ulfric officers to organize freely, he gives them time to turn a funeral movement into an armed one. If he asks the Legion to occupy Eastmarch, the political meaning of the duel changes overnight. Torygg would have survived by Nordic custom only to rule through imperial soldiers. Every path available to him can feed the story his opponents want to tell. Eastmarch becomes the immediate center of the crisis. Ulfric leaves no canonical heir, prepared to inherit both his jarldom and his movement. Galmar Stone-Fist possesses military authority, loyalty among Stormcloak veterans, and absolute commitment to independence. But he does not possess Ulfric political position. He is not the son of the previous Jarl of Windhelm. He did not train with the Greybeards. He did not make the Markarth bargain in his own name. He did not stand at the moot as a Jarl speaking against continued imperial rule. If Galmar declares himself the replacement for Ulfric, every rival can ask why a war leader should receive a crown because his commander died in a duel that commander chose. Galmar is therefore more dangerous as an organizer than as a claimant. He can keep veterans together. He can prevent panic in Windhelm. He can argue that the cause did not belong to one man. He can demand that Eastmarch refuse outside troops and preserve its own forces. What he cannot easily do is order Jarl Skald in the Pale, Jarl Career in Winterhold, or Al-Lila Lawgiver in the Rift to treat him as the next High King. Canonical Ulfric could place those Jarls inside a movement centered on his personal claim. Galmar can ask for solidarity, but he cannot recreate the same hierarchy without inventing a legitimacy that the setting does not give him. Jorleif also matters more than he does in the war. Known from the game as Steward of Windhelm, he represents continuity in the administration of Eastmarch even while the political leadership above him collapses. Trade still needs to enter the city. Guards still need wages. Disputes in the Grey Quarter do not vanish. The Argonian dockworkers remain outside the walls at night. House, Shattershield, and the Cruel Sea family still compete for influence. A dead Jarl does not suspend the ordinary pressures of a hold. If Galmar tries to turn every resource toward revolt, the people responsible for keeping Windhelm functioning gain reasons to resist him. The absence of a clear successor also creates the first split among Ulfric allies. Some want immediate retaliation. Some want a new moot, arguing that a duel between the High King and a powerful Jarl has demonstrated that Skyrim needs a fresh political settlement. Others want Eastmarch to choose a new Jarl before any larger claim is made. Talos worshippers may care more about ending Thalmor arrests than about placing Galmar or any other warrior on a throne. Landowners and merchants may hate the Concordat while fearing a war that closes roads through the Rift and Pale. Canon lets Ulfric compress these interests beneath one banner. His death separates them again. Torygg has a narrow opportunity inside that separation. Sibyl Stentor knew him from childhood, and later told the last Dragonborn that Torygg respected Ulfric advocacy for independence. She even believed that a direct appeal from Ulfric might have moved the High King toward declaring independence, although she also explained why Torygg had resisted that course. Skyrim alone could not safely face the Dominion. Many Nords served in the imperial military. Food and other resources moved through imperial ties. Torygg regarded the Empire of Tiber Septim as part of the same history that produced Talos worship. These are not the instincts of a ruler eager to become a Thalmor servant. Surviving Ulfric forces Torygg to act on that contradiction. He has defeated the most dangerous separatist in Skyrim, yet he has also heard the grievance behind the challenge, at closer range than any imperial official in Cyrodiil. He cannot plausibly tell the Easternholds that nothing needs to change. A king who does that wastes the authority won in the duel. His strongest course is to separate the question of independence from the question of Thalmor access. He can remain within the Empire while pressing for every lawful limit on Dominion interference that Cyrodiil can tolerate. That does not mean Torygg can restore open Talos worship by decree. The White-Gold Concordat still binds the Empire. The Markarth incident has already exposed how dangerous local promises can become when they contradict the treaty. If Torygg publicly opens a Temple of Talos in solitude, he hands the Dominion evidence of imperial violation and risks turning a political crisis into a renewed international one. His room for movement exists in enforcement, procedure, local cooperation, and political pressure on the Emperor, not in pretending the Concordat has vanished. This distinction becomes the center of Torygg rule during the first months. He can demand that Jarls report Thalmor actions. He can pressure imperial authorities to keep local guards involved when arrests occur. He can insist that the Dominion receive no more cooperation than the treaty requires. He can use the court at solitude to collect grievances from holds whose people see justiciars operating on their roads. None of these actions abolish the ban. Each gives Torygg a way to show that remaining within the Empire does not require indifference toward the people harmed by it. Jarl Balgruf the Greater becomes essential to that approach. In canon, Balgruf refuses to commit Whiterun until the war reaches his gates because his loyalty is to his hold before either faction. He distrusts Ulfric ambition and resists imperial pressure when it threatens his independence of judgment. A living Torygg offers Balgruf a political center that the canonical civil war lacks. He does not have to choose between Ulfric and a foreign-born military governor. He can support the High King while still demanding room for Whiterun to govern itself. That support does not make Balgruf obedient. His value comes from the opposite trait. If Torygg overreaches against Eastmarch, Balgruf can warn him that Whiterun will not become a staging ground for punishment. If Galmar threatens the roads, Balgruf can close the passes and deny rebel movement through the center of Skyrim. If imperial officers request a permanent buildup, Balgruf can demand limits. In canon, his neutrality delays the war. In this timeline, the same character trait helps prevent one by giving both solitude and the Eastern, holds a powerful example of a Jarl who rejects secession without surrendering local authority. The Eastern Jarls do not all follow Balgruf. Jarl Skald carries deep hostility toward the Empire. Jarl Corir rules a winter hold that has its own resentment toward outside powers and the College. Jarl Lila Lawgiver is sympathetic to the Stormcloak cause in the canonical war, even while Maven Blackbriar holds enormous influence around her. None receives a reason to love the Concordat because Ulfric dies. What changes is the cost of converting sympathy into open rebellion. With Torygg alive, each Jarl would be rising against a High King chosen by the Moot and strengthened by a victory in Nordic combat. That is a harder case to sell than following a rival Jarl after the High King has died. The rift illustrates the problem. Lila can denounce Thalmor interference and honor Ulfric memory. She can allow sympathetic veterans to gather. Yet, the economy around Riften remains entangled with merchants, the Blackbriar family, and routes that benefit from stability. Maven does not need to care about imperial ideals to oppose a war that threatens her interests. Canon gives her a path to the Jarl's seat. When the Empire wins the rift without a civil war, she has less reason to seek formal office. She can apply pressure through wealth and connections, while Lila remains responsible for public decisions. The result is a hold that talks more fiercely than it marches. The Pale moves closer to armed defiance. Skald has fewer reasons to compromise and a stronger instinct for the old Nordic cause. Yet even he faces a practical question: against whom does he march? Torygg has not invited the Thalmor to rule Dawnstar. He has not abolished the Jarls. He has not ordered the Legion to occupy the Pale. Ulfric chose a personal challenge and died in it. An uprising must therefore be justified by the Concordat itself, rather than by the killing of a king. That argument has support, but it also exposes the movement to the same fear Torygg already holds. Skyrim may win separation from Cyrodiil only to stand weaker against the Aldmeri Dominion. The Reach remains more volatile than any clean map of loyal and disloyal holds suggests. The Markarth incident preceded the duel by decades of grievance packed into a few years. The Forsworn still exist. Modenak still survives in Sidnamine, under the arrangement that gives the Silverblood family hidden influence over him. Jarl Igmund still carries the legacy of the agreements and betrayals surrounding the recapture of Markarth. Thongvor Silverblood favors the Stormcloak side in canon. Ulfric Death gives men like him a symbol they can use without handing them control of the whole movement. That makes the Reach a likely source of money, weapons, and political agitation for anti-imperial groups, but it does not automatically produce a coordinated rebellion. The Silverblood family wants power in Markarth. Galmar wants Skyrim independence. Skald wants freedom from imperial authority. Talos worshippers want the right to worship openly. Forsworn fighters want a Reach that belongs to them rather than to Nord Jarls. These goals overlap only in their hostility toward the present order. Ulfric could force several of them into the same war. His death allows their differences to work against coordination. Solitude exploits that division by refusing to create a single enemy. Torygg's strongest decision is restraint after victory. He can honor the duel as a Nordic matter, permit Ulfric body to return to Windhelm, and avoid turning Galmar into the commander of a rescue or revenge campaign. He can refuse demands from hard imperial loyalists for a sweep through Eastmarch. He can also make clear that attacks on roads, forts, or royal officials will be treated as rebellion. The line is narrow, but it shifts the burden of escalation onto the Eastern leaders. The Empire benefits immediately. In canon, General Tullius arrives in Skyrim to suppress a rebellion serious enough to threaten imperial control of the province. By the opening at Helgen, he has captured Ulfric, and is trying to end the war by executing its leader. In this timeline, that mission never forms in the same way. Cyrodiil may still send senior officers, inspectors, and reinforcements because unrest remains real, but there is no living rival High King commanding a field army. Tullius is less likely to become the defining political figure of Western Skyrim because Torygg is alive to do that work himself. This matters beyond the province. Every legionary not consumed by battles at Whiterun, Fort Dunstad, Fort Greenwall, Windhelm, or Solitude can remain part of the wider imperial military system. The Empire still expects another confrontation with the Aldmeri Dominion. General Tullius makes that strategic concern clear in the canonical war. He regards the rebellion as a dangerous distraction from a larger enemy. Remove the full civil war, and the Empire keeps more Nord soldiers, more trained officers, more supplies, and more time for the southern frontier. The Dominion sees the same arithmetic. Elenwen cannot celebrate Ulfric Death without contradicting the strategy written in the Thalmor dossier. An indecisive civil war drains both Skyrim and the Empire. Torygg victory threatens to deny the Dominion that drain. Yet Elenwen cannot simply appoint another Ulfric. The dossier shows that even the real Ulfric had become uncooperative with direct Thalmor contact after Markarth. Any obvious attempt by the Thalmor to create a replacement would poison that replacement among the very Nords he needs to lead. Elenwen therefore has to work through pressures that already exist. Talos enforcement is the strongest. Every arrest can deepen anger toward the Empire. Every imperial official who cooperates can be presented by separatists as evidence that Torygg promises mean little. Every refusal by a local jarl can create a diplomatic dispute that forces Cyrodiil to choose between defending the jarl and obeying the treaty. The Dominion does not need to invent a grievance. It needs to make the existing one impossible to ignore. This strategy carries a risk that canon partially hides. During a civil war, the Thalmor can present themselves as one force among many, while Nords kill Nords. Without that war, the Justiciars become more visible as the common source of anger. A Talos worshipper in Whiterun and a Talos worshipper in Windhelm may disagree about the Empire, but both can hate the same patrol taking prisoners on the road. A Legion veteran may reject Galmar rebellion and still despise the sight of an Altmer agent searching a Nord home. Torygg can use that overlap to strengthen a position that canon never gives him time to build: Imperial loyalty joined to open hostility toward Dominion interference. The Thalmor cannot easily answer by reducing enforcement, because the Talos ban is one of the political gains won through the Concordat. Relaxing pressure allows the Empire to recover social cohesion. Increasing pressure risks creating the unity the Dominion hoped the Civil War would destroy. Ulfric living provided a useful middle condition. His rebellion directed Nord anger inward while forcing Imperial resources north. Ulfric dead removes that convenient channel. By the end of the first year after the duel, the most likely political map of Skyrim therefore resembles neither canonical faction victory. Torygg controls Solitude and retains recognition as High King. Whiterun supports stability without becoming an occupied Imperial base. Eastmarch remains deeply hostile, but lacks a universally accepted rebel claimant. The Pale and Winterhold protest. The Rift sympathizes with resistance while its internal interests discourage reckless war. The Reach remains dangerous for reasons that extend far beyond Ulfric. The Empire gains time. The Thalmor gains reasons to provoke but fewer safe ways to do it. Then the dragons return. Alduin return does not depend on Ulfric victory, Torygg death, or the Civil War. The events around the time wound at the throat of the world belong to a much older chain of history. The ancient Nord heroes used an Elder Scroll to cast Alduin forward in time. His reappearance in 4E201 therefore remains one of the forces that survives the point of divergence. What changes is the political world beneath him. The exact fate of Helgen becomes uncertain. Canon places Ulfric, General Tullius, Ralof, Hadvar, and the future last Dragonborn at the same execution because Tullius captured the rebel leader at Darkwater Crossing. Ulfric death in Solitude removes the reason for that convoy, and therefore removes the canonical concentration of prisoners and commanders at Helgen. Alduin can still return in 4E201. Whether his first major attack falls on Helgen in the same hour is harder to defend, because the political event that placed so many important people there has disappeared. The safer consequence is that the dragon crisis begins without assuming the same opening route for every participant. Alduin emerges. Dragons begin returning from burial sites as he raises them. Reports spread from hold to hold. The last Dragonborn still exists as the figure, named by prophecy, but the path that reveals that identity may differ. The person who canonically escapes Helgen may be somewhere else when the first dragon attacks a settlement. Farengar's secret fire may still seek information about dragons once reports reach Whiterun. Bleakfall's Barrow and its Dragonstone still exist. The Greybeards still possess the knowledge needed to recognize a new Dragonborn once the voice announces that person to Skyrim. That uncertainty does not weaken the political comparison. It strengthens it. Canon confronts the dragon threat, while a civil war divides forts, manpower, roads, and command. Torygg timeline confronts the same class of threat, with the holds still arguing but not yet fielding two organized armies against each other. Whiterun does not need to fear that sending guards to Riverwood will be interpreted as joining one side. Arl Balgruf can move troops against dragons without calculating whether Ulfric will use the movement as an excuse to attack the city. Solitude can also coordinate without treating every request from the east as a military trick. Torygg has a reason to call the Jarls into common defense because dragons do what the Thalmor and the Concordat cannot. They create a threat that ignores every political border inside Skyrim. A dragon striking near Dawnstar does not ask whether Skald supports independence. A dragon raised near Riften does not care whether Lila trusts Solitude. Farmers, mines, roads, and watchtowers become targets whose loss harms every faction. Galmar faces his hardest decision here. If he spends Eastmarch strength on a war against Torygg while dragons rise, he risks appearing less committed to Skyrim than the king he condemns. If he sends warriors under a royal command, he weakens the political separation Ulfric built. The likely compromise is local defense. Eastmarch keeps its soldiers under Eastmarch officers, fights dragons and bandits inside its own territory, and cooperates only where necessity demands it. Galmar can call that defense of Skyrim rather than service to solitude. Torygg can accept the arrangement because forcing a loyalty ceremony would matter less than keeping the roads open. That creates a loose military unity without political reconciliation. It also fits Jarl Balgruuf better than the canonical civil war does. Balgruuf can work with Solitude, Windhelm, and local commanders on dragon warnings while continuing to reject outside control of Whiterun. The holds begin sharing information because no one benefits from keeping a dragon sighting secret. Messengers travel for reasons that have nothing to do with tax demands or troop levies. Each successful act of cooperation makes immediate civil war harder to restart. The Greybeards remain outside this political contest. Arngeir does not become Torygg advisor. High Hrothgar does not endorse the Empire. The Way of the Voice still treats the Thu'um as a sacred discipline rather than a tool for worldly conquest. Ulfric time among the Greybeards remains part of his past, and his decision to use the voice in war remains his own. Torygg cannot claim the Greybeard's blessing simply because he survived that power. Their distance limits one tempting shortcut. No side gets to turn High Hrothgar into a political seal of approval. The appearance of the last Dragonborn eventually creates another source of authority. But the alternate history must keep the player character free of invented choices. Canon allows the Dragonborn to support the Empire, support the Stormcloaks, delay the Civil War, or force a temporary truce at High Hrothgar during Season Unending. There is no single canonical faction choice that can be imported into this timeline. The most that can be said is that a Skyrim without a full civil war gives the Dragonborn fewer reasons to spend time capturing forts for either army, and more room to focus on Alduin. That difference can become enormous. In canon, the road to trapping Odaviing at Dragon's Reach may be interrupted by the need to settle or suspend the civil war, because Jarl Balgruuf will not risk using his palace while enemy armies threaten Whiterun. In Torygg timeline, there is no Stormcloak army preparing to seize the city. Dragon's Reach remains under the same Jarl. The political obstacle that produces Season Unending may never exist. The last Dragonborn can pursue Alduin without first making concessions over holds between General Tullius and Ulfric. A faster campaign against Alduin is possible, although certainty would go beyond the evidence. The Dragonborn still has to find the right knowledge, recover the Elder Scroll, learn Dragonrend, confront Alduin, and reach Sovngarde. Delphine and Esbern still carry their own priorities. Paarthurnax still has his history. The Thalmor still hunt the Blades. Removing the Civil War does not solve any of those problems. It removes one large political obstruction from the middle of them. For Torygg, the dragon crisis becomes a test that the duel alone could never provide. Ulfric challenged his ability to defend Skyrim. Surviving the challenge gives Torygg a personal victory. Coordinating the province against dragons gives him a chance to answer the accusation behind it. Every convoy that reaches a threatened village, every guard force moved between holds, every store of grain protected from attack adds practical weight to the title of High King. Torygg can gain legitimacy through administration rather than through another duel. This is where Ulfric memory begins to change. His supporters can still honor him as the man who demanded independence, but they must explain why an immediate war against Torygg is necessary, while Torygg is visibly directing defense against dragons. The stronger Torygg performs, the harder it becomes to preserve the image of him as a useless imperial ornament. Ulfric argument shifts from Torygg personal weakness to the deeper claim that no worthy king of Skyrim should answer to Cyrodiil or accept the Concordat. That shift matters because it makes the independence movement less dependent on one personality and more dependent on policy. In the short term, this weakens rebellion. In the long term, it can make separatism harder to extinguish. A political movement centered on Ulfric can die with Ulfric, lose with Ulfric, or be discredited by Ulfric mistakes. A movement centered on the continued presence of Thalmor Justiciars and the continued illegality of Talos worship receives fresh evidence every time those conditions remain. The first 2 or 3 years, therefore, produce an uneasy advantage for Torygg. Skyrim avoids the large battles that Cannon tears through its holds. Whiterun does not endure a civil war assault. Windhelm does not face an imperial siege. Solitude does not become the final target of a Stormcloak campaign. Forts change fewer hands. Farms around contested roads lose fewer workers to levies. Families with members in both imperial service and eastern militias are less likely to meet across a shield wall. The lives saved are strategic as well as human. The Empire keeps tax revenue and recruits. The holds keep guards for bandits, forsworn, vampires, and dragons. Merchants continue using roads that would otherwise pass between rival checkpoints. Blacksmiths repair equipment for local forces instead of feeding 2 armies. Mines lose fewer workers to conscription. The province remains damaged by the dragon crisis and by ordinary violence, but it avoids choosing to add a civil war on top of them. No faction receives all the gains. Without a decisive imperial conquest, the Empire cannot replace hostile Jarls with loyal ones. Jarl Layla remains in Riften rather than yielding the seat to Maven Blackbriar through an imperial victory. Jarl Skald remains in Dawnstar unless local events remove him. Jarl Courier remains in Winterhold. These rulers continue to criticize Solitude and Cyrodiil from positions of legal authority. Torygg preserves unity by tolerating opposition that a victorious General Tullius would have removed. That produces a noisier but more stable Skyrim. The Eastern Jarls can block initiatives, resist troop requests, and make every royal gathering difficult. Torygg has to bargain rather than issue commands to a province divided by occupation. Balgruf influence grows because his middle position becomes useful in disputes. Lila can support Talos worshippers without sending an army west. Skald can condemn imperial policy while still taking aid against a dragon attack. The political system remains strained, but the strain happens inside councils and local authority rather than across siege lines. Riften also shows why avoiding the war does not produce a better government everywhere. Maven Blackbriar still controls wealth, business, intimidation, and connections. The Thieves' Guild still exists beneath the city. Corruption does not depend on Ulfric. Lila remaining Jarl prevents the exact imperial succession seen in Canyon, but it does not remove Maven influence. A stable province can preserve bad local arrangements as easily as good ones. Winehelm makes the point even more sharply. Ulfric death does not repair the Grey Quarter. Dunmer refugees do not automatically receive trust from Nord residents. Argonians remain excluded from living inside the city walls under the conditions seen in the game, unless a later local ruler changes that policy. The economic and ethnic tensions tied to the Red Year, migration, labor, and Ulfric's style of politics continue. A different Jarl can reduce or worsen them, but the alternate timeline has no basis for assuming automatic reform. The succession of Eastmarch remains one of the largest uncertainties, and a credible timeline has to leave part of it open. Skyrim gives no canonical named heir, who clearly takes Ulfric's place if he dies before the war. The Hold would need to recognize a new Jarl through its own political customs and through the larger authority of the High King. Torygg would want a successor capable of governing Windhelm without reigniting secession. Eastmarch nobles would resist any candidate viewed as imposed from solitude. Galmar would support someone committed to Ulfric cause or try to keep military pressure on whoever takes the seat. What Torygg cannot safely do is install a Western loyalist by force. That would supply the rebellion with the proof it lacks. His best outcome is an Eastmarch Jarl, acceptable enough to local elites and hostile enough to the Thalmor that the appointment does not read as surrender. Such a figure is not named in canon, so the timeline should not invent one and pretend certainty. The political effect can still be traced. The longer the succession requires negotiation, the less likely Galmar can turn Ulfric funeral network into an immediate invasion of Whiterun. Galmar himself remains a problem for years. He is too committed to independence to become a comfortable royal servant. He is also too closely tied to Ulfric to disappear without consequence. Torygg can arrest him and risk creating a second martyr. He can exile him and give Eastern militants a living commander outside royal reach. He can tolerate him under watch and allow him to become the voice that reminds every gathering what Ulfric wanted. Restraint again offers the least damaging option, especially if Galmar avoids direct attacks. This produces a form of armed politics rather than open war. Veterans keep weapons. Local militias train. Solitude keeps garrisons ready. Eastmarch refuses some requests and complies with others. The Pale talks about independence. The Reach sends money through families whose interests benefit from weakening the current order. The Rift offers political sympathy. None of these pieces creates the field army. Ulfric commanded in canon because no one can make all of them obey the same plan. The Thalmor try to solve that coordination problem for their own benefit without exposing their hand. Their safest method remains pressure through the Concordat. A harsh arrest in the Pale can strengthen Skald. A dispute in Markarth can empower Silver Blood rhetoric. An investigation in Riften can embarrass Lila. The Dominion can create many local fires and hope one grows large enough to pull Imperial troops north. Torygg can answer only by making each fire local. He has every incentive to separate Talos cases from questions of treason. A man caught worshipping Talos is politically dangerous to arrest, but treating every worshipper as a separatist would hand Galmar recruits. A Jarl protesting a justiciar is not automatically a rebel. A veteran honoring Ulfric is not automatically an enemy soldier. The more distinctions Torygg preserves, the harder it becomes for Elenwen to produce two clean camps. Cyrodiil may find this frustrating. Imperial governments prefer reliable obedience from provincial rulers, especially while preparing for another war with the Dominion. Yet Torygg can argue from results. Skyrim pays more, recruits more, and destroys fewer forts when its High King absorbs political anger instead of forcing every dispute into military categories. A living Torygg also gives the Empire something it lacks in canon: a Nord ruler who can defend Imperial membership in a Nordic voice without requiring General Tullius to explain Skyrim to itself. That does not make Torygg an equal partner to the Emperor. Skyrim remains part of the Empire. The Concordat remains an imperial treaty. Thalmor rights under it cannot be erased by a solitude decree. If Cyrodiil yields to Dominion pressure, Torygg eventually has to choose whether he will enforce a policy he hates, resist it and risk imperial discipline, or push toward the independence Ulfric once demanded. His victory in the duel delays that choice. It does not remove it. The Dominion understands the delay as a strategic loss, because time helps the Empire recover. The Great War ended only because both sides had paid enormous costs. Hammerfell continued fighting after rejecting the terms imposed on it. The Empire expects that peace with the Dominion will not last forever. Every year without a Skyrim civil war gives Cyrodiil more opportunity to rebuild legions and secure northern supply. Every Nord who dies fighting another Nord in canon is a soldier unavailable for that future struggle. Torygg timeline preserves more of them. By roughly 4E205, the balance begins to look very different from the province seen at the start of Skyrim. There is still an independence movement, but it is less capable of marching under one commander. There is still imperial authority, but it depends more on Torygg personal legitimacy than on Legion occupation. There is still Thalmor enforcement, but its political cost has risen because the civil war no longer absorbs most public anger. The Dragon Crisis, assuming the last Dragonborn defeats Elduin as the main prophecy allows, has also given Skyrim a shared victory that neither Civil War faction can claim alone. The aftermath of Elduin defeat matters. In canon, both the Empire and Stormcloaks can imagine that they represent the future of Skyrim once the dragon threat recedes. In this timeline, Torygg can claim that the province survived its greatest immediate danger without tearing itself in half. Eastern leaders can answer, that survival proves Skyrim possesses enough strength to stand on its own. The same success supports opposing conclusions. That is politically healthier than a siege, but it does not settle the argument. Ulfric memory grows cleaner with distance. The details of policy become easier to forget than the image of a Jarl who challenged the High King and died. Supporters omit the uncertainty of what would have happened after independence. Critics emphasize that he chose combat over negotiation. Veterans remember Morkarth. Families remember Thalmor arrests. Bards and local storytellers reduce complicated politics into lines that travel farther than court records. The dead man becomes easier to use because he cannot object to any version. Torygg faces the opposite process. A living ruler accumulates compromises. Every year gives him decisions that anger one side. If he limits Thalmor access, Imperial diplomats worry. If he cooperates with a treaty demand, Talos worshippers accuse him of weakness. If he grants Eastmarch broad freedom, Western Jarls question unequal treatment. If he tightens royal authority, Eastern Jarls invoke Ulfric. Ulfric reputation can remain fixed at the moment of defiance. Torygg has to govern after that moment. This is why the duel cannot produce a permanent imperial victory by itself. It prevents one military structure from forming. It does not erase the political conditions that made that structure possible. The Concordat keeps generating resentment. The Dominion keeps seeking imperial weakness. The Empire keeps needing Skyrim manpower and resources. Skyrim keeps containing Jarls with different interests, old regional rivalries, and competing ideas about how much authority the High King should exercise. The strongest long-term change is that the next contest over Skyrim crown becomes more important than the immediate one. Torygg is young in 4E201. If he rules for years, he can build relationships, his canonical death prevented. Balgruuf can become an ally without becoming a subordinate. The Eastern Jarls can become habitual opposition rather than wartime enemies. A new Jarl of Eastmarch can emerge through local politics rather than battlefield conquest. Elisif can remain High Queen beside Torygg instead of becoming the young widow around whom Imperial loyalists organize solitude. Elisif's position changes greatly, even though her personality does not need to. Canon places her in the Jarl's seat of Huffingar, after Torygg's death, dependent on experienced advisors such as Falk Firebeard and surrounded by Imperial military power. With Torygg alive, she remains his wife and a member of the royal court rather than the main claimant of the Western faction. This removes one weakness from solitude. The West no longer asks a grieving and inexperienced Jarl to symbolize continuity, while General Tullius directs the war. Torygg can carry the political burden himself. Falk Firebeard and Sybil Stentor become more valuable because they provide continuity from the reign of Islad and the early years of Torygg. Sybil, in particular, has already identified the political truth. The canonical warberries, Torygg respected Ulfric, even while rejecting immediate independence. That knowledge gives the court a way to understand the East without accepting the separatist program. A ruler surrounded only by imperial officers might mistake every protest for treason. Torygg Court has people who know the grievance, predates the rebellion. General Tullius may still appear in Skyrim, especially once dragons and regional militias create security concerns, but his role changes. He can serve as an imperial military coordinator, rather than the man expected to restore the province by defeating a rival High King. This suits his canonical personality better than trying to make him a court politician. Tullius is practical. If Torygg keeps the province inside the empire without requiring sieges, Tullius has little reason to demand a war for its own sake. His attention can remain on readiness, roads, forts, and the larger Dominion threat. Legate Ricky becomes a bridge rather than a symbol of divided Nord loyalty inside a civil war. Canon gives her deep loyalty to the Empire and deep understanding of Nord custom. In a Skyrim where Eastern militias refuse some royal orders but do not march under Ulfric, that background is useful. She can deal with Nord commanders without pretending their grievances are foreign to her. She also knows the cost of treating every opponent as an enemy. Her presence makes restraint more plausible within the Imperial command structure. The lack of a canonical Battle of White-Run has effects that continue for. White-Run remains physically stronger. Heimskr can still preach Talos in the city, unless local authorities stop him. The Battleborn and Greymane feud remains political and personal, rather than becoming one small reflection of a full siege. The city keeps its role as the central market and crossroads of Skyrim. Balgruf does not have to flee to solitude after a Stormcloak victory, and Vignar Greymane does not need to replace him through conquest. The hold avoids a forced change of government. The same applies to the other holds. No civil war means fewer Jarls replaced. According to which faction occupies their capital, the old structure survives longer. That slows political change and preserves rulers who may be weak, compromised, or unpopular. Stability has a price. A province that avoids war also avoids some of the abrupt removals war would have caused. Torygg has to work with the Jarls he has, rather than the Jarls a victorious army would install. Markarth may become the hardest test of that system after the Dragon Crisis. The Forsworn remain active in the Reach. The Silverblood family remains powerful. Thalmor presence around the city continues, because Talos enforcement has special importance there. Jarl Igmund remains tied to the memory of the Markarth incident. Every side possesses reasons to distrust the others. Ulfric death removes one claimant, but leaves the place where much of his later movement gained meaning. Torygg cannot solve the Reach by repeating Ulfric methods. A campaign of repression against Forsworn communities would deepen a different rebellion. Openly granting Talos worship would violate the treaty. Handing control to the Silverblood family would strengthen actors who benefit from instability. Ignoring the region would allow local violence to continue. The Reach therefore limits how much attention the High King can give Eastmarch. Skyrim Unity remains a collection of problems managed at the same time, not a single civil war switch turned off. This also prevents the alternate timeline from becoming a story where Torygg's survival fixes every injustice. The Forsworn still have their own history and demands. Dunmer in Windhelm still face prejudice. Argonians at the docks still live under restrictions. The College of Winterhold remains mistrusted by much of the hold around it. Riften remains corrupt. Bandits still control roads and forts beyond the reach of regular patrols. Vampires, necromancers, Daedric cults, and other threats do not wait for political unity to resolve themselves. What changes is the amount of state capacity available to respond. A guard who is not fighting at a civil war fort can patrol a road. A Jarl who is not replacing officers after an occupation can focus on local rule. A legion cohort, not committed to Windhelm, can reinforce a frontier or protect a supply route. A blacksmith not supplying a siege can equip hold guards. These gains are ordinary, which makes them strategically important over years. The Dominion has to consider that accumulation. Its preferred condition in the Ulfric dossier is an indecisive conflict. By 4E205 or 4E206, that condition has failed to appear. The Empire remains flawed and divided, yet Skyrim is not draining it at the expected rate. Elenwen can intensify intelligence work and political pressure, but every additional operation carries exposure risk. If Thalmor agents are caught supporting both radical separatists and hard imperial responses, the discovery could unite factions against them. A skilled diplomat, therefore, avoids actions that depend on impossible secrecy. The more likely Dominion policy is patience. The Thalmor can wait for Torygg to make mistakes. They can wait for a succession dispute in Eastmarch. They can wait for an imperial demand that angers the Jarls. They can wait for another Talos arrest to produce violence. They can wait for the next Great War itself. Time helps the Empire recover. But time also gives every political system opportunities to fail. By 4E208, the Ulfric question has become a generational argument rather than an active command structure. Younger Nords who never served under him know the duel through family stories. Veterans remember the man rather than the symbol. Galmar, if still politically active, represents continuity with a movement that never achieved its canonical army. His inability to replace Ulfric becomes part of the reason separatists search for a different kind of leader, perhaps a Jarl with wider acceptance or a coalition strong enough to call for a moot. A new independence coalition would face a different Torygg from the one Ulfric challenged. The High King has survived the duel, the dragon crisis, years of Thalmor pressure, and repeated disputes with hostile Jarls. His authority is earned through endurance and governance rather than inherited from Islad alone. Calling him untested becomes impossible. Calling him tied to the Empire remains easy. The movement, therefore, has to attack policy instead of personal weakness. That makes a second duel less attractive. Ulfric used the old custom partly because it allowed him to collapse a political argument into a test of martial legitimacy. Torygg's survival destroys that shortcut. Another challenger risks confirming Torygg's strength rather than exposing weakness. A future separatist movement is more likely to demand a moot coordinated refusal of imperial policy or collective secession by several holds than to place all its hopes on one warrior entering the Blue Palace. Such a movement could eventually be more dangerous to the Empire than Ulfric personal rebellion, because it would be harder to end by killing one leader. Yet it would also be harder to create. Jarls must agree on goals. Merchants must accept economic risk. Nord soldiers in imperial service must decide where loyalty lies. The Reach must be handled without pretending its people share the same national project as Eastmarch. Whiterun must be persuaded rather than conquered. Ulfric solved those coordination problems through personality, urgency, and war. A coalition has to solve them through politics. Torygg gains his best chance to prevent that coalition by changing the imperial relationship before the next crisis. He can press for greater provincial control over internal enforcement. He can make the cost of Thalmor operations visible to Cyrodiil. He can argue that the Empire needs Nord loyalty, more than it needs enthusiastic compliance with Dominion demands. He cannot rewrite the Concordat alone, but he can become the loudest imperial ruler, insisting that the treaty is a temporary humiliation rather than a permanent political order. This position may even bring him closer to Ulfric original grievance while keeping him opposed to Ulfric method. That is the irony at the center of the alternate timeline. Sybil believed Torygg might have answered a direct appeal for independence. His stated reasons for staying with the Empire were practical rather than affectionate toward the Thalmor. Surviving the duel does not make him more submissive. It gives him personal reason to prove that Skyrim can resist Dominion pressure without destroying imperial unity. The Empire would likely accept much of that rhetoric as long as Torygg continues delivering stability. Cyrodiil also wants the Dominion defeated. Eventually, General Tullius openly regards the Thalmor as the larger enemy, even while fighting Stormcloaks. The disagreement is over timing and method. Torygg can place Skyrim inside that imperial strategy rather than outside it. Nord resentment becomes a demand for preparation against the Dominion instead of a demand for immediate civil war. This does not satisfy the hardest separatists. For Galmar and others committed to a free Skyrim, waiting for Cyrodiil remains another form of submission. Every year the Talos ban remains in law proves their point. Every justiciar on a road proves it again. They can argue that the Empire needs Skyrim strength precisely because the Empire is too weak to defend its own gods. And traditions, Torygg's success at governing, may reduce their numbers without erasing their argument. The next Great War, whenever it comes, becomes the event most likely to decide whether Torygg's strategy succeeds. If the Empire fights the Dominion and Torygg leads Skyrim forces against the Thalmor, the old accusation of collaboration loses force. Talos worshippers can see the hated treaty treated as a wartime relic. Nord legionaries and local militias can fight the enemy they already agree on. Ulfric memory may be absorbed into a broader imperial war against the Dominion, with supporters claiming that the struggle he wanted has finally arrived by another route. If the Empire delays too long, yields again, or signs another humiliating peace, Torygg's position collapses from the opposite direction. He has spent years asking Skyrim to remain patient because imperial unity offers the best chance against the Dominion. A second failure by Cyrodiil would prove the separatist case more strongly than any speech by Galmar. Torygg could then face the choice Ulfric tried to force in 4E201, remain with an empire that cannot protect Nordic interests or lead Skyrim out of it himself. This is why the alternate history cannot end with a permanent answer to Skyrim independence. The duel changes the first war, not every future decision. What it does allow is a more favorable starting position for both Skyrim and the Empire when the next external crisis arrives. Fewer dead soldiers, fewer damaged forts, a living High King with personal legitimacy. A central hold that has not been conquered. Eastern Jarls, who remain hostile, but have years of practice opposing within the political order. By 4E211, the most plausible Skyrim is therefore still part of the Empire, but on more argumentative terms. The province has avoided the canonical civil war. Torygg remains the central political figure if he survives ordinary dangers beyond the scope of the divergence. Solitude does not rule an obedient north. Eastmarch does not forget Ulfric. Talos worship remains a source of conflict until the treaty changes. The Thalmor remain active because their larger strategy has not vanished. Skyrim unity is real enough to prevent armies from meeting at Whiterun and fragile enough that one major imperial failure could still break it. The military balance outside Skyrim is better for Cyrodiil. This is the clearest strategic consequence. The Empire does not spend years suppressing a province whose soldiers it may soon need against the Dominion. The Legion keeps more Nord. Manpower's supply lines through Skyrim remain more reliable. Tullius, Ricky, and other experienced officers spend less effort on internal conquest. The Dominion loses one of the outcomes. Its own dossier wanted most. An indecisive war that weakens both sides. The political balance inside Skyrim is less comfortable. Ulfric death denies separatists their strongest living leader but gives them a death that can be remembered as sacrifice. Torygg victory denies imperial hardliners the excuse for total occupation but forces the High King to live beside Jarls, who openly hate parts of imperial policy. The Concordat remains the wound neither victory nor restraint can close. That unresolved pressure becomes the price of avoiding war. Several things remain almost exactly as dangerous as they were before the duel. The Forsworn still contest the Reach. The Thalmor still seek imperial weakness. The Dominion still benefits from division among men. The Empire still carries the exhaustion of the Great War. Windhelm still contains deep social tension between Nords, Dunmer, and Argonians. Riften still contains corruption. The Greybeards still reject the use of the voice for ordinary political ambition. Alduin still returns because his return belongs to a history far older than Ulfric. These surviving forces matter because they prevent the counterfactual from becoming a reward for one changed sword stroke. Torygg wins a duel, not a perfect future. He gains years in which to govern, bargain, prepare, and fail. Ulfric supporters lose a commander, not every reason they followed him. The Empire gains soldiers, not freedom from the treaty that created the crisis. The Thalmor lose a useful civil war, not their ability to search for another fracture. The central title question can therefore be answered clearly. Ulfric dying against Torygg probably prevents the Stormcloak rebellion from becoming the same province-wide civil war seen in 4E201. No other canonical figure combines his claim, history, military following, and symbolic power well enough to replace him immediately. Galmar can preserve armed resistance, but cannot easily become High King. The Eastern Jarls can obstruct Torygg, but face a far higher barrier to open revolt against a living king who has survived the very custom meant to expose his weakness. Torygg's survival also changes how Skyrim interprets strength. Canon allows Ulfric to argue that the High King could not defend himself, and therefore could not defend Skyrim. This timeline gives Torygg the opposite reputation. He accepted the challenge and lived. He then has the chance to defend the province through the Dragon Crisis without a civil war consuming the holds. The argument that he is personally unfit loses much of its force. Ulfric's larger argument survives because it never depended entirely on Torygg's skill with a sword. Talos remains outlawed. Thalmor justiciars remain present. The Empire remains bound by a peace many Nords regard as shameful. The Dominion remains a future enemy. Those facts give separatists new recruits even when Torygg governs well. The debate shifts from whether Torygg deserves the crown to whether any worthy High King should accept the political limits imposed through Serodial. That may be the greatest unintended effect of Ulfric's death. In canon, his personality dominates the independence question so completely that supporters and opponents can reduce the war to a judgment of one man, remove him, and the policy dispute becomes harder to avoid. Imperial loyalists cannot answer every complaint by pointing to Ulfric ambition. Separatists cannot answer every practical objection by pointing to Ulfric victories. Skyrim has to confront the actual cost of remaining in the Empire and the actual risk of leaving it. The Dominion would prefer that argument to be settled with swords before the Empire is ready for another war. Torygg gives Skyrim another possibility: delay the final choice, preserve military strength, and turn anger toward the enemy that created the Concordat rather than toward neighboring holds. Whether that strategy survives a second Great War cannot be known from the events of 4E201. It is simply the strongest path opened by the different outcome in solitude. Ulfric enters the Blue Palace intending to show that Torygg cannot defend Skyrim. His death fails to prove that charge. It also ensures that Torygg could never ignore the question behind it. For the next decade, the High King must defend his province from dragons, Thalmor pressure, hostile Jarls, the memory of Markarth, and the limits of an empire, preparing for another war. He has more time than canon gives him, more authority than Ulfric expected him to possess, and fewer excuses if he wastes either. By 4E211 there are no Stormcloak siege lines outside Whiterun in this timeline, no Imperial assault breaking Windhelm, and no young widow ruling Solitude because her husband fell in a duel. There are still hidden Talos shrines. There are still Thalmor agents on Skyrim roads. There are still Eastern halls where Ulfric's name carries honor, and Western halls, where his challenge is remembered as reckless ambition, Torygg keeps the crown that Ulfric came to take. The war Ulfric expected to lead never reaches the shape he gave it in canon. The argument that brought him to solitude survives him.